Paideia today. We're going to talk today about the wrath of Achilles, the first word that occurs in this great book and which dominates the entire epic. I'm Dr. Scott Masson.
I am Dr. Friesen, Dr. Bill Friesen.
And so we're excited about this topic because it's part and parcel with the discussion of Achilles' Wrath is the whole topic of heroism. Because Achilles, along with Odysseus, are the two model heroes of the Homeric epics. And the one that defines Achilles seems to be this word wrath, because it's the very first word in the epic, but also it seems to drive the plot, and the whole narrative is bound up with Achilles' great wrath, which basically takes 23 and a half books to play out in various ways. And so that's what we wanted to talk about. I'm going to give it over to Bill for a second, because we wanted to talk about how this was bound up in not just a sense of heroism in the sense of the superhero. This is the protagonist. There's more than he's the main protagonist. It's caught up in a worldview, a religious view, a political view, an ethical standpoint. All of these are part of heroism. You agree with that, right?
Yes. It's the Iliad is very much about a man not doing something for many, many books, the Iliad, and only at the very end does the protagonist actually spring into action. Homer isn't coy about what he wants to talk about here. It's not like a lot of modern novels or other works like that. A good epic writer will tell you oftentimes in the first stanza what the main focus is, what he wants to talk about.
Yeah.
And what Homer wants to talk about is wrath, is rage, is anger. And to a lot of people, I think that seems like a very odd thing around which to build something as big and complex as an epic. But
particularly when he sits in basically as a temper tantrum for
I find that there's
2/3 of the book.
I think it bears analogy to other great works out there like Hamlet. Hamlet just basically sits around trying to figure out what to do until the very end of a very long work. So also with the Iliad. So if it is about wrath, then what is Achilles angry at? That's an overwhelming question which you have to ask at the front end. And I think a lot of students, and even a lot of professors, come to the Iliad and they're not thinking deeply about the context into which they're reading, because a lot of Achilles' arguments, a lot of the arguments that happen throughout the Iliad, and it's full of arguments, everyone's arguing continuously, take for granted the wrath and the thing at which the wrath is directed. And my view is that the wrath is directed at mortality. Achilles' great curse is that he is mortal, he will die. And remember, in the Greek view, when you die, you effectively face annihilation. It's not like other worldviews out there. You're going to live, you're going to be heroic, then you're going to die, and you're going to be wiped out, and will come a time when it will be as if you had never been.
I think it's worse than annihilation. Annihilation wouldn't exist at all, right? The Greek view of the afterlife, which we see in the Odyssey, is that you do live on, but your life is so meaningless and empty that you would rather not live on, and yet you do in this shadowy, virtueless state of, it's not eternity, because I think there's a reincarnation prospect after 1,000 years or something like that, but it's a life devoid of anything that is admirable or desirable even. There's sort of, in the Homeric underworld, you have to be given blood to speak even, and just sort of sit there sullen, tired, I'm not quite sure.
Well, somehow your ability to speak is tied in with notions of rational self-consciousness. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that works.
No.
But one thing of which the ancient Greeks were very aware was that rational self-consciousness made you different from all the other creatures in creation.
Yeah.
And being able to contemplate the self, whether in a heroic sense or in any other sense, allowed you to do two key things. A, you could step outside of yourself and contemplate that self and judge that self, whether you saw yourself as the hero or somebody who was anti-hero or whatever it was. But you're making judgments about the self. Those are moral judgments. Yes, right? Moral judgments, ethical judgments, all these sorts of things, and practical judgments too, I guess. But that's kind of beside the point. The second thing, being able to rationally step outside of yourself and contemplate yourself allows you to do, is to know that you're looking at a self who is going to die.
Yes.
That person and the value, which you can now assess via rational self-consciousness, is value which is going to be eradicated by the nature of the universe.
So there's something that is very keenly perceived, deeply felt, widely shared, in fact universally shared amongst the Greeks, which is that death is wrong in some ways. I don't even think it's wrong in the sense that it's morally incorrect, although there may be that even. Mm-hmm. It's just there is something that is fundamentally anti-human about dying, and there is a sense that the immortality of the gods ought to be theirs, but it isn't. And they can't change that, even if they're a demigod like Achilles or Odysseus, right? These are men who have divine parentage, at least on one side, but their human parentage is condemning them to die, and so they sense the loss even more keenly than regular mortals, who also will sense it, but to a lesser degree, it seems. Yeah,
one of the remarkable things is that a lot of the figures in epic come from or have divine origins. One parent or the other is a god figure or a godlike figure, and yet they all die. And this changes everything. The only one actually who manages to avoid that is Heracles. He has kind of an apotheosis.
Yeah.
But he's notable for being the exception. All the others die, and they die horribly, and they die tragically. Sometimes they die heroically, but does the heroism even matter? So that throws a lot of things into very sharp relief indeed.
Well, how does that differ then from the modern sense of heroism? Because heroism is a term that is used to this very day. The hero is basically the protagonist.
Yeah.
In any story, there is a hero of some sort, at least if it's somebody we admire, so it's an admirable quality. Anyone whom we admire is now a hero, but isn't necessarily connected with all of those things.
There's a couple of ways I think you can approach this. I think one really useful way to look at the Iliad is that it is an analysis and an exploration of hero types. Most of the main figures in there are heroic in some sense or another, and what I find fascinating, one of the things I find fascinating, is just how different the species of heroism are. There's not one sort of generic heroism that you're seeing throughout the Iliad with individual figures. They each come forward and almost seem to be an advocate for a certain species of heroism. So you take the figure of Aias or Ajax, call him what you will. He's a very primitive kind of hero. He's powerful, he's decisive, he's forthright. There's a force of nature about a guy like that, and it's very admirable.
Physically great in battle.
Yeah, so some people have said, a figure like that is a very primitive kind of a hero. He's very animalistic, he's very visceral. And yet there's something immediately, tangibly admirable about him. Whereas you have another figure.
Because there's moral courage that goes with that, right?
There is, yeah. It's not just physical prowess. He is a forthright man of integrity, and at a certain point in Book 9, Achilles praises him as exactly that. I like the way you speak. I like the fact that you're
virtuous. That as well.
Yeah. Then you have other figures like Odysseus. Odysseus is a classical hero type again. He's a trickster hero. He's the trickster figure. You'll see other figures like this throughout Western literature. Almost every mythology has at least one trickster hero. Odysseus is the great Greek trickster figure, but if you look at the Bible, you've got Jacob. Yeah. If you look at Norse mythology, you've got Loki. The list goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
So then begs another question.
But Achilles is the Ajax type, right?
Achilles is
although he's a complex figure.
Yeah, he's a very, very complex figure.
Excellent at both.
He rises above the linear Ajax.
Just like Odysseus does.
Yeah. Right? So his mastery of matters intellectual, of problem solving and things like that, and understanding complex world issues is extremely advanced, far beyond people like Ajax or Sarpedon or other sort of primitive heroes like this.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there is also that animal quality. He shows tremendous prowess on the battlefield, the way others do not. Right. He's an object of terror. And this is one of the points of Homer's dramatic genius, I think, is that he spent so many books of the Iliad building up and yet deferring and delaying the impending dread of Achilles going back onto that battlefield. By the time Achilles finally snaps after the death of Patroclus, you are so tense and awaiting such a towering figure, and Achilles just unleashes that lethality on the battlefield.
He doesn't disappoint.
He does not disappoint. And at the same time, Homer is clever enough to do the same thing to a lesser degree with Hector.
Yes.
Hector, your opinion of him and your anticipation of his heroism and his lethality on the battlefield goes up and up and up. And then at the end, you get this almost juvenile moment of satisfaction where you got these two towering figures surrounded by anticipation, and Homer says, let's get these guys to fight.
Yeah.
And that's the big moment of drama. And you are so tense and so full of anticipation at that moment that the dramatic outplay of that is absolutely catastrophic in the Greek sense of the word.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that's correct and helpful. I see it in Achilles and Odysseus as manifesting the same sort of heroism, but one is a little bit more exemplary in military prowess, namely Achilles, and one is a little bit more exemplary in verbal prowess. And both are theaters of conflict, though.
Yes.
Right? Because the Iliad is a battle, it's a physical battle, there's a war, but the war goes on not just on the battlefield between the Greeks and the Trojans. There's also a battle of words in the Greek camp. There's discord that's been brought right from the outset. It begins with Achilles' dispute with Agamemnon, which basically results in Achilles being out of the fight, and they can't win the war without Achilles.
Yes.
But it's that logical discord or communal discord of words that needs to be resolved before he can become the man that he was born to be. But Odysseus represents that, the man of words. So he's a man of action, but words are a form of action. They're the prelude to action, but they're even a form of action.
The Greeks have a very complex sense of the ways in which rhetoric and debate tie into physical conflict. And the ideal Greek citizen of the polis is somebody who they expect that he's going to be trained in military matters. You have to be a fighting man. You have to have you have to own your own weapons. You have to be trained up as a young man in all matters athletic, primarily with a view to physical conflict.
And if you're a Spartan and you're a woman, it's the same thing. Because so the Spartan polis is specifically for military prowess.
So you're there to defend your family. You're there to defend your city-state, your polis. But you do this also verbally. We have to remember that the Greeks are intensely litigious. And so you, while you're being trained up in the martial arts of various sort, you also have to be trained up in verbal combat.
Yeah.
And you're going to end up in courts at certain points defending the interests of your people, whether that's your family or your polis. So both are involved in battle, and oftentimes the rhetoric precedes, intersperses, or follows physical battle as well. And we're going to see this in later literatures as well when we get to Anglo-Saxon literature and stuff like this. There's this notion of flighting, and flighting can either stand in for or actually precede battle. And you'll see it in the modern forms of trash talk and what have you. That happens before. But the Greeks are incredibly artistic and eloquent about how they handle this. This is not mere trash talk. This is almost a work of art, which is also a work of violence. I'm going to come back and talk about that in later podcasts.
So that's on the individual level. I agree with it. It's a total expression of individualism, but the polis itself is there to further the end of individualism and further the end of glory. The purpose of the polis is to allow free men, and they are only men that are allowed into the realm of the political life.
That's right.
To manifest their excellence.
Yeah, their playoffs.
Through words, right? And they will be observed by other men, other free men who don't have to labor for a living. And that allows them to perpetuate their fame, which takes us back to this issue of heroism and why Achilles is so outraged. It's because his fame is diminished by the very fact that he's going to die.
And yet here's the part.
Right?
Yes. This is the paradox that Homer really zeroes in on. Only the mortal can be heroic, because only the mortal is actually risking something when he goes into battle. So you face the problem of death, the problem of mortality, the problem that you will be annihilated in a sense. And in order to deal with that, you want to attain as much glory, as much kleos as you can for your legacy, and you want your legacy to live on as long as possible after you're gone. Yeah. So it's a form of kind of contingent
and the way that works is other people will talk about Achilles and Odysseus.
Exactly. But in order to attain the glory and that legacy, you actually have to risk that very same mortality. And so you're caught in this awful, awful paradox. And Achilles is smart enough to know it.
He is.
And he thinks to himself, the only way for me to beat the game is not to play it. And so he sits down in his tent with Patroclus, picks up his lyre, which is very interesting, and allows his brethren on the battlefield to die in huge numbers horribly.
Yes, but on the other hand, at that point, he verges on being what a term that Homer doesn't use. He almost becomes the Antihero, because he then becomes like Paris, who's also a man who is unwilling to risk it all on the battlefield. He's back in the bedroom of Helen, and he will not fight. And so both of them are outside of the theater of conflict, and the hero, the great man Achilles, is very much like the most contemptible man in the whole of the Iliad.
That's interesting, yeah.
Right? So in that sense, they're both outside the action. So now the hero, at least by the end of book, or the beginning of book 9, and particularly with the decision that Achilles takes, that he's not going to fight, and he's not willing to risk his life for the sake of this king, Agamemnon, he almost becomes, or threatens to become, the contradiction of himself, because remember, that was the prophecy that he would become the man who would, the great Achilles who slew his Trojan foes and brought down Troy, but he was going to die a young man.
That's right.
And thereby be famous. He has renounced that at this point. So he threatens to become like a Paris.
Yeah, it's not really a secret in the Iliad that Achilles is the best of men.
It's openly stated.
Yeah.
And all the gods, and this is the further thing, we talked about this just before, but this is really interesting to me. The gods seem to be possessed with the affairs of men, to the point where they are, even though they're orchestrating the action to some degree, they're certainly interfering and involving themselves in various ways, and we can talk about that. They also seem to be obsessed with what these men are going to do, to the point where they get dragged into conflict themselves.
They're living by proxy through the heroes,
Right.
which is interesting because to a large extent so is the audience.
Yes.
The audience is looking on the heroes and living vicariously through the heroes, even as the gods themselves on the other side of the action are doing the same thing. To what extent do the heroes offer us, again, that opportunity for sort of a mimetic impulse to be explored? If we see something that strikes us powerfully and that we admire, there's an instinctive desire, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, to emulate it, to commune with it, to identify with that hero and more specifically his qualities. To some extent, then you begin acting out, and the gods begin acting out in the actual action of the Iliad. And they end up descending into the battlefield disastrously, as it turns out. And the gods are mixed up with the men, but to some extent, so potentially is the audience. And this, I think, is where oftentimes we get into a bit of a dead end when we're talking about heroism. A lot of people will want to talk about the function of heroism, which is important, I'll grant you.
So what is the function of heroism?
To inspire emulation of those heroic qualities of a certain sort.
The mimesis.
Exactly. So this is why I think Homer and the Greeks are so obsessed with the best models of heroism, because that's what's going to inspire emulation. But is that the only purpose of displaying heroism like that in the Iliad? I think it's, like I said before, I think it's a contingent result of displaying and dramatizing certain species of heroism. I don't think that's the fundamental end of what's going on there. There's a sense.
So it's not just a teaching tool, it's not just...
It's much more than that. It's an artistic tool. It transcends practical value into an end in and of itself.
I think that's
To use
true.
later language.
I think that's true. And if it didn't do that, it wouldn't be what it actually is, clearly for the Greeks, which is a religious text. Homer being regarded as the teacher of all Greece.
Yeah.
By all the Greeks, whatever polis they're in, they look to Homer and revere him as such, and his place is so highly regarded that the philosophers have to assault Homer and the whole Homeric tradition in order to assert their own claim to the true end of the polis in human life, which is the understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful,
Right.
the just. So this is Socrates' objection to the Sophists, because the Sophists are a lot like the Greeks that, as they're portrayed in the Iliad, they're always trying to win arguments. That's the whole point. They use rhetoric to win. Whereas in Socrates' case, or at least as the mouthpiece of Plato, the purpose of the Logos is to understand the good and the true and the beautiful. It's not to win, it's to be right, it's to to know the right, it's to know the good, it's to know the beautiful, right? So there's
Yeah.
but that's a later, off topic to some degree, but let's talk about the paradox of heroism.
Yeah. Like I said, the notion here is that the Iliad is an existential text. It's obsessed with the problem of being, and here more specifically with non-being, annihilation of that which was. Remember, we get to the end of the Odyssey, as we'll look at later on, and Odysseus is sitting there back home on Ithaca and quiet in a corner and wrapped in a cloak and what have you, and he's lamenting the sorrow, the tragic sorrow of life, and he ends up concluding that the only thing better for a man than dying young is never to have been born at all. Beingness itself is a terrible thing. It sucks. So you'd best avoid it if you can, but you can't, so you're stuck with it. But then, of course, having been born, now, of course, you have to contemplate your own death and you're caught in this terrible, awful cycle.
Right. Now, that's at the end of his whole life, after he's come back from 10 years in the theater of war.
Seems to be triumphant.
And comes back finally after 10 years to be the greatest of all the heroes,
That's
because
right.
Achilles is dead, Agamemnon's been murdered. He comes back and cleans up with the suitors, and at the end of all that, his wise proclamation on all of life is that.
Better not to have been born at all. And you'll see other authors come back to this again and again. Achilles is very subtle. He knows that this is the problem. The problem isn't just that he wants to rise in life and attain the glory, attain the achievements, achieve the fame that other men are all striving after. It's that it's all existentially useless. It's purposeless. There's no point to it all. And this is why he doesn't play the game. And notice what happens here. Achilles, until book 24, Achilles doesn't relent of his wrath. It just finds different objects. Agamemnon's almost a distraction.
And even then, I don't think it's over. It's just over for the Iliad.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't yet destroyed the city, which he's going to, right?
That's
the
right.
city's going to burn, and it doesn't happen in the Iliad.
It does not. It's that his wrath is directed at Agamemnon in the foreground. In the background, though, he's looking beyond all of this here. And his wrath is at the gods, but it's not even at the gods, it's at the fates which control the gods.
That's right.
Part about the Greek cosmology.
Yep.
The gods don't control fate. Fate controls them.
And the fates are impersonal, basically. They're right? They're unlike
And inscrutable.
and inscrutable.
That's right.
There's no understanding them, and as powerful as Zeus is, the preeminent of all the gods, he has to obey the fates.
He does. He does. And fate decrees that Achilles will be born, will live, will attain glory, and will die.
And it's his job to make sure that happens.
And that is something that drives Achilles into existential wrath. And that wrath, strangely, is almost divine because it's backed up by this tremendous will. It's one of the most powerful wills we ever see explored and celebrated in the epic traditions of the West.
That's really good.
He is unbreakable. This is classic Wille zur Macht. This is will to power stuff.
Well, it's really, the word manus in Greek there is actually used of the gods. It's not the usual. Yeah, it's not the usual word for Greek for will there in Greek. It's particularly that of so it's a godlike wrath as well. So it's a wrath that he has perhaps been given by the gods, and so in a sense he's like the gods who are also angry and who are also bellicose and committed to conflict, because the gods themselves are in a state of perpetual war.
Mm-hmm.
Words and deeds, they're also like that. They just don't die,
Right.
but they're always embroiled in conflict. There's a ceaseless conflict in the background there, which is then also brought into the human theater. And then what's interesting is that word manus, which is the first word, wrath, then translates into a later word, which is in English translated as demonic. So because the
daimonis.
Yes,
Right.
and which is also a divinely inspired wrath. So when he finally breaks out and takes his and takes the fight to Hector, it's demonic. Not demonic in the Christian sense.
No, I know what you mean.
No, I know, but the demonic in the sense that the gods have brought this on him, and now he's so the gods are in a sense the Deus ex machina. They're coming out of the machine, and now they're working through Achilles.
So it's literally a sacred or a divine wrath. It's not just wrath, it's a divine wrath.
It's a divine sort of wrath. And the only check on this is the gods themselves seem to be sickened at Achilles' unwillingness to relent. So he's dragging Hector around the city walls, and there is no limit to this. He's unwilling to be placated. Nothing will stop him, and the gods themselves are so sickened by this that they say, this has to stop because this man has no pity.
Interesting.
That's really, he has no pity. And that, we pick that up when we come to the tragedy. The purpose of tragedy, says Aristotle, is to purge pity and fear. Now, is Aristotle saying and disagreeing with the gods that really, and seeking to perpetuate the same sense that Achilles had, that really the wrath was legitimate and he wants a divine status for human beings, if you see what I'm saying there, because in the tragedy, his description of it, the purpose of tragedy is to purge pity and fear.
That's right.
Right? But that word pity there is right there at the end of the Iliad, and the gods are outraged or sickened by Achilles' lack of pity.
This is also brings up another interesting motif, I think. Achilles seems to be driven by this divine wrath. His will is divine as he pursues the wrath, and the result of the wrath is two things. Ironically, it's his heroism, it's his kleos, it's his glory, it's his reputation, it's his legacy, but it's also the source of endless death. And so heroism, again, is bound up deeply and functionally.
And killing.
And killing
and being
boundlessly.
Killed, but also being killed,
yes.
How you die.
So Achilles' ability to kill is of a divine nature. Paris, on the other hand, has chosen not the realm of battle, not the realm of debate, not the realm of social and public fame and greatness. He's rejected all those things. Rather, he's chosen the woman, the most beautiful woman in the world. That's his. And he wants to dally with her behind the walls of Troy for endless days while all his erstwhile allies are slaughtered on the battlefield while he's in bed with a woman.
Everything sacred is being...
That's right. And so he's in the realm of not death, but I mean, potentially insofar as he lays with Helen, producing new life. And so you have this divinely inspired drive towards new life, producing children, one presumes. On the other hand, you've got this other hero who produces endless death. And you have this horrible cycle. And these guys are both, ironically, both of them, for much of the text, are sitting idle. One the best of men, one the worst of men, one producing life in theory, one producing potentially death in the future. And there they both sit and watch.
You know what struck me while you're saying that is that that's where we first meet Odysseus in the Odyssey as well. In Book 5, he's on the island of Calypso, who is a goddess, a nymph, and offers him eternal life. He can eat ambrosia, he can live there, and he will live eternally in the state of bliss, satisfying his lusts, being a Paris-like figure.
Right.
And he is desperate to get off the island. People don't, I mean, when I talk to undergrads about this, they think, what's so bad about all this? And on the other hand, some are outraged the fact that he's been unfaithful to his wife, which is understandable from our vantage point. And perhaps from Penelope's for that matter, but that doesn't seem to be what's bothering Achilles or Odysseus that much. He wants to get home because that is the only way in which his fame will be complete, like his arete will achieve its ultimate end, which is to come back home and clear his house of the suitors, because that's his destiny.
That's right.
Right, so he is offered the outcome of Paris, anonymity,
right,
in eternity, in a lustful relationship, just like Paris has, and he wants nothing to do with it. So in both cases, I mean, there's a lot of foils going on, I think.
Yeah, I mean, time and again in the Odyssey, we see Odysseus reject the appeal of the material world, the material comforts, even material fame and things like this. But it's interesting that he rejects the existential solution, as it were, that drives Achilles into such divine wrath.
Yeah.
He has a way out, like Achilles does not.
Yes.
And he rejects it.
Yes.
So that we'll come back and we'll
come to that. We'll talk about the Odyssey.
there was another point I wanted to make about Achilles, but it's just gone completely out of my head here.
Well, I might come back in a second.
Okay.
Let me think about, because you mentioned the fact that this Paris taking this path of comfort, that itself is divinely orchestrated. So in book 23 of the Iliad, it comes as a surprise to the modern reader, but it would not be unknown to Homer's audience. The whole precipitating event for this battle is a conflict provoked by Eris. Eris, E-R-I-S, is one of the fates, discord.
Right.
And Eris throws an apple in the midst of Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, and the apple says, "For the fairest." No, who's the fairest of them all? Mirror, mirror on the wall. The three goddesses, of course, think that they are, and they take it to Zeus. Now Zeus shows his wisdom by refusing to tell or decide who is, although Zeus is renowned for his wisdom, he shows his wisdom by refusing to get into this decision about who is the fairest of them all.
A lot of times the ancient Greeks show their wisdom by exactly that. I've mentioned it once already of Achilles. He knows that the only way to win the game is not to play the game in the first place. Zeus does the same thing here. It's like, I'm not even getting involved. I'm not even going to talk about it. I'm turning my back and walking away.
So Hermes, the messenger of the gods, takes this apple and takes it to a mountain, the name of which I forget, and there is who? Paris. And Paris is then offered by the three goddesses rewards for they've got their thumb on the balance scale. You tell me that I'm the fairest, and if you do, I will reward you.
Each one will reward him according to
their nature, more or less.
Precisely. And I think this is one of the... It's
Hera
fascinating.
Hera offers him, and then what do they offer?
Hera offers him essentially domestic bliss, which to the modern reader doesn't sound terribly attractive, but you have to remember that the ancient Greek man, and indeed many, many cultures thereafter, you would be spending the bulk of your life in a domestic relationship, a domestic space in the home.
Because you work at home.
You work at home, yes. This is the locus of your marriage. This is where you have your children. This is where you build those sorts of social and domestic dreams. You're going to log the vast amount of your time in that world. And Hera says, I can make that.
It's not just peace, it will be fruitfulness, right?
It will be fruitful, it will be fertile, it will be a good, wholesome place.
The work of your life will be flourish.
That's right. It's the place of truth and beauty and goodness realized in domestic form. So
Right.
that's actually much more powerful and appeal to the thinking man than it might seem to the modern reader. That's a big deal. Athena offers him greatness in the public realm. The realm of rhetoric, the realm of leadership, the realm of the polis. In everybody's eyes, I will bring you to greatness.
Like Odysseus.
Yes. Now, Achilles can kind of reach that world. He's an excellent orator. He's very much a leader of men, which people tend to forget because of his animal ferocity.
Right.
This is a very sharp, very social, very eloquent, very intelligent, deep thinking man. In fact, I think I would argue that Achilles runs deeper at the level of wisdom than does Odysseus. Odysseus is tricky. Odysseus is very clever. And some people have said he is merely clever. And he shows up very badly against the deep, brooding wisdom of Achilles. So,
I think it's slightly unfair, but...
well, Odysseus has enough admirers.
That's fair.
He doesn't need me.
No.
But
I agree that Achilles is underrated in his excellence in the area of wisdom.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so Athena's...
The third of them?
The third, of course, is Aphrodite's offer, which is...
Sex.
Paris is a young man, and it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. Young men have one overwhelming concern oftentimes, and Aphrodite goes, as it were, straight for the jugular. She knows. And Paris goes for what the ancient Greeks would have considered the lowest of all appeals.
Right.
She goes for that base, visceral, sexual gratification.
And so she offers him the most beautiful of women, her offspring.
But the problem is, she belongs to another man.
Right.
Yes. And
there arises the conflict.
There arises the conflict.
Paris is, right.
And Aphrodite actually gives to Paris something which violates the justice of the gods themselves. And this is key to understanding the
because
gods.
Hera is also the goddess of marriage, so
That's
it violates
right.
that then, right?
That's right. And it creates a public scandal. So Athena is not happy about this, plus the fact that both Hera and Athena have been rejected by Paris.
Personally. Yeah.
So there's also perhaps a commentary there on the nature of woman, but we'll get into that perhaps in later podcasts. What I was going to say also is that these three choices are in a sense choices which any person, for the most part when they're younger, faces. What do I want in the future of my life? Do I want to build a happy home? Is that going to be priority one? Do I want public fame and glory? Maybe it's through leadership, maybe it's through celebrity, it could be almost anything, but that's a
worldly marks of success.
Sure.
Right.
Or do I just want to satisfy the base visceral pleasures, whether that's women or drink or whatever it might be? Yeah, to satisfy the lusts of the body, however conceived. And to some extent, they're mutually exclusive directions.
Yes.
So every person who reads the Iliad actually faces this awful choice, which, by the way, isn't in the Iliad. It's extraneous to the Iliad. It's referenced a little bit here and there, but it's not actually treated in detail in the Iliad. So people since time immemorial have been taking this three-way choice as kind of a life lesson, which is very reductive, I think, ultimately. But it's an interesting life lesson nevertheless. Which of the three am I going to actually choose? How did it go wrong for Paris? How does it go right for others? Odysseus has to come back to this choice himself in certain ways. And then on top of that, trichotomy, if you like, you've also got the choice that Achilles puts in front of us. He's got either fame and glory on the one hand, but he's going to die young, as it were. He's going to burn out young. And young people typically, when they're given the choice between comfortable, secure life and the wild life of glory, which ends young, think to themselves, well, I'm going to burn out young. That's what I'm going to do. Young people are very ambitious for the most part. Achilles' other choice, as outlined by
in our day, they're not. That's the problem. They've been demotivated so much by the education system, by politics, by the example set by parents, by the example set by their own heroes, whether they're superheroes or the sports cultural heroes. So the models of heroism are almost anarchic and lead to a life of cynicism and despair, I think. But that's a different context. But historically, you're certainly correct that young people would rather flame out and die young than to live a long old life.
Yeah, it's the rock star ideal.
Yeah.
That you're going to burn out young, but you're going to achieve great glory, the Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin.
I just don't see that much of these days amongst young people.
Maybe you're right, and we can talk about why that is, because there does seem to be a cult of mediocrity out there that pervades the younger imaginations. But like I said, we can talk about that extensively. We don't find that world here. Achilles,
most decidedly not. No.
Yeah, Achilles has this choice, fame and glory on the one hand, but it's going to cost you your life. It's going to shorten your years.
But all the Greeks think that's it, and there's no dispute.
Yeah, and Achilles says, I got a different option. I can go home and live this quiet, comfortable life to a great old age. It's essentially, to use a modern equivalent, it's it's the house in the suburbs, it's the white picket fence, it's the labradoodle in the SUV, and you get to the end of it and you wonder what was the point of all that, and boom, you're dead.
Okay, so really interesting. So Achilles chooses this early death and fame, but then Odysseus, when he meets him in the Odyssey, in the underworld, this I've always been fascinated. This is why these texts, Homer's texts, are so great. As soon as you think that everything is settled, Homer flips it on you.
Yep.
So Achilles dies. He is famous. He's so famous that really the trajectory of his life dominates both epics. And so famous that Alexander the Great, Aristotle's pupil, takes the Iliad with him on his campaign of war and wants to emulate the great Achilles. But when Odysseus meets him in the underworld in the Odyssey and starts to talk to him about his great fame, Achilles stops him and says, let me stop you right there, because I would rather have lived a long life of no fame rather than come down to this place early. That's how bad the afterlife is.
Yeah.
Now that's from Achilles' mouth, the great hero. So at that point, I'm wondering whether Homer is lamenting, and I think he is, the terrible worldview and religion of the Greeks, which he presents and sees as inescapable, and yet it sees as without any consolation. Even fame is not a consolation. If Achilles will say this, and Odysseus will say it, as you said at the end of the Odyssey, then what hope do they have? And I think that is part of the religion that you talked about at the beginning of the Greeks, that they are, even the Greek gods are in a state of constant war. Men are going to get caught up in that. They can't escape it, and life in the end is vain, it is short, and it is bloody, and for all of the appeal of fame, the fame is also vainglorious.
I think a lot of people who come to the Iliad they try to read it like a modern reader. And so they anticipate that if this is a great inspirational story, I'm not sure that that's what it was meant to be, but if it is, then somewhere in this you're going to get the solution, you're going to find the hope. And I think that's, you can't actually inject that into the Iliad, because I think at the root of it, existentially, there is a profound despair that inhabits not just the Iliad, but also the Odyssey. Achilles, he achieves, you said earlier on, he chooses that life of glory. I'm not sure he does choose the life of glory. I think wrath drives him and chooses for him.
He was fated.
Yeah, and so he's not really in control of going into battle. It's just that all of a sudden his wrath goes from existential nihilism and Agamemnon, it shifts off of those targets and on to Hector, who has killed somebody he deeply loved and valued, Patroclus. But at the end of the day, was this done for the sake of glory? Was it done for any of these things? Because I've got a little section here that I've photocopied because somebody stole my copy of the Iliad. By the way, if you're reading the Iliad, let me strongly recommend that you buy Richard Lattimore's translation of the Iliad. It is absolutely masterful. Nothing else even comes close. Obviously, the best option of them all is to read it in ancient Greek, but if you don't have ancient Greek under your belt, well, there you are.
I agree with that, by the way.
And what he says in Book 9, lines 318 through 20 says, "Fate is the same for the man who holds back, the same if he fights hard. We are all held in a single honor, the brave with the weaklings. A man dies still if he has done nothing, as the one who has done much." And this comes right after he condemns Odysseus for saying, I hate the very gates of Hades itself, the man who says one thing and holds another in his heart. So this is all bound up in a package deal. We don't have time to explore the way those two play off each other. But I do want to sort of zero in on this. What's the point of greatness or non-greatness? There is no point. The same reward ultimately comes to both men. The one who hides in a hole or the one who dies gloriously in battle, it's the same. It's annihilation. And so it's not even that Achilles is choosing between the life of glory and the life of peace and comfort and longevity. It's that both of them are bankrupt. And Odysseus, I think, really underscoring the despair of these two great texts, says at the end, it's not just that the glory is useless. The long, comfortable life is useless as well. Better I had never been born. Full stop. That's better.
Yeah.
These are deeply nihilistic texts.
And so this is, for me, when I first understood what you've just said, because I did come to understand that when I studied this in Germany, it became very clear to me what the Greek view actually was. That's when Christianity, what it offered distinctively to that, seemed to be so appealing and so different, and why the gospel would be so attractive, because the nature of the gods in the Greeks is constant strife, constant conflict, committed to violence and committed to killing, and without a moral nature, whereas the God of Christianity was presenting life in himself, order, and yet with moral excellence and blamelessness that he was offering to others through through one event of conflict, the death of his son at the hands of his enemies and even of his friends. So those things were, I think, quite appealing, and then they offered eternal life with that as well, the very thing that the Greeks were trying to pursue through the life of fame, which, as we could see, was empty, and yet here was being offered in an infinitely meaningful way. So it's a direct speaking into that culture in a way that I think is, if you don't understand the Greek world of heroism, you don't really understand how radically different this was.
We easily take for granted this worldview that we have, that you just articulated here, that this is kind of our starting point for life and purpose and meaning and value and stuff of that nature. The Greeks don't have that. It's a culture of despair that turns very quickly into a culture of pure cynicism. We'll talk about that later, especially when we get to the Odyssey. And the only way to transcend that is this, what I think, frankly, the Greeks figured out very cynically. It was this cheap trick of glory whereby, you know, your fame and your stories live on after you. And to his credit, Achilles did something right, because we're talking about him today.
Yep.
When we get to the Romans, we see a radical shift. Virgil makes a really fundamental shift, and all of a sudden your glory is perpetuated in the patria, in the family, and in all these sorts of things. And all of a sudden it's for this community and its legacy that you live on.
Yeah, but who's his goddess? Who's the
Aphrodite, is it not?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, okay.
So this is another. So we'll come to that. But this is why it becomes really interesting.
Yeah, the conversational aspect of this.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Right.
And when we encounter Germanic literatures, we're going to find the same sort of problem that these early Greeks were fighting with. They've got that symbol of what's called the Ouroboros, which is a motif which they have in artistic design and jewelry and stuff like this, whereby a snake is eating its own tail.
In a perpetual circle.
That's right, it's a cycle, it grows continuously, so life is there, and there in abundance is the realm of the Vanir, the two families of gods.
You mean the Lion King, the Circle of Life?
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
I was just about breaking the song there. And on the other hand, this endless death, this cycle of life and death, and is so pointless because the snake devours its own tail even as it grows. And their great symbol for it is the Middle-earth serpent, the Mythiaormar. And this is the thing, this cycle which rises up at the Ragnarök and threatens to wipe out the world. And Thor kills it, but he does so at the expense of his own life. You've got to remember that the Norse gods can die, whereas these Greek gods we're talking about cannot die. And that changes the divine cosmology radically when we come to the Germanic pantheon of gods and how they see the world. But we'll talk about all that later.
Let's put that on hold for now and wrap this one up, because otherwise we're going to get you on your topics of great interest, and there will be no end of words.
It's true, there is no end of words until death.
Good. We're done for now, and we'll pick it up next session with, what were we going to talk about?
We're going to talk about Book 9. We're going to talk about rhetoric and rhetorical combat, I expect.
Yeah. Good.
Okay.
Fantastic.